The wind moved like an old tired creature across the winter plains, dragging long sighs over the frozen grass and the splintering fences of Lydia Harrow's lonely homestead. Dawn had not yet fully risen, but a faint blue light pressed against the horizon, cold and uncertain, much like the young widow herself. Lydia stood near the woodpile, breath curling in front of her like pale ghosts, her hands stiff from the night's frost. She wore the same wool shawl she had clung to since autumn, its edges frayed, its warmth fading, yet she held it tightly around her shoulders as if it carried the last memory of gentler days. The axe trembled in her grasp as she lifted it again, splitting another piece of brittle wood that scattered shards into the snow. Her arms ached, but she did not pause. Stillness, she had learned, only allowed the cold to sink deeper. Her homestead was a tired thing now. The barn roof sagged from the weight of old storms, its beams groaning as though each winter morning brought it closer to surrender. Inside, her horse lay weak, ribs showing like the lines of an old map, breath thin and labored. Lydia visited him every hour through the night, pressing her cheek to his neck, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Hunger had taken nearly everything from her this season, and she feared the winter would claim the rest before spring dared return. She tried to remember warmth, Caleb's laughter, the rich golden glow of late summer evenings, the way their small home once felt filled with hope rather than echoing emptiness. His illness had swept through him like wildfire, stealing his voice, then his strength, and finally the last light from his eyes. The cabin had never felt the same since. She often imagined she heard him in the quiet, a soft step across the floorboards, a sigh behind her, a reminder of a life that was no longer hers. She shook those thoughts away as she gathered the wood. Survival allowed little space for remembering. The wind shifted. She froze, sensing something more than weather moving across the land. A distant thudding reached her ears, rhythmic and deliberate, like slow heartbeats echoing across the snow. She turned toward the open plain, shielding her eyes from the pale morning glare. Two dark shapes emerged from the white distance, enormous and steady, growing larger with every breath. Horses. And riders. Not ordinary ones. The men atop them sat tall as pine trunks, wrapped in thick winter hides, their long white hair braided and touched by frost. The nearer figure carried a posture of deep quiet, his gaze fixed on her homestead as though he had known it in another life. The other rode with a heavier presence, shoulders broad, expression unreadable beneath his lined face. They did not hurry. They approached with the weight of men who understood time was not their enemy. Lydia's pulse quickened. She stepped back until her boots pressed against the woodpile. Encounters with Apache elders were rare, and winter made every meeting more unpredictable. Stories in town traveled wild, warnings offered by men who feared more than they understood, but Lydia had learned long ago not to trust the talk of frightened people. Still, fear stirred in her anyway, tangled with curiosity she could not quite push aside. The riders stopped a few paces from her, the snow settling around them as though even the wind held its breath. The quiet one dismounted first. His movements were slow, deliberate, revealing an age near 65, yet his strength remained evident in the firm set of his shoulders. His eyes, dark and deep as river stones, drifted over the broken fence, the cracked barn door, the smoke that barely rose from her chimney. When his gaze returned to her, Lydia felt something she could not name, something that didn't feel like threat at all. His companion dismounted as well, boots sinking into the snow with a soft crunch. He scanned the land, then stepped aside, allowing the quieter man to speak. When he finally did, his voice carried the warmth of distant embers, low and steady, shaped by a language older than the cold morning air. "Pack your things and come with us." For a moment Lydia wondered if she had imagined the words. They were not harsh, not commanding, but carried a quiet certainty that unnerved her more than anger ever could. She shook her head, pulling her shawl tighter around her. She did not know these men, and she had nothing left to pack, even if she had wanted to leave. Her home was failing, but it was the last piece of Caleb she had, the last promise she had made to herself, to endure. She whispered that she could not go, her voice fragile as ice forming on still water. The man listened, studying her with a depth that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't been in months. He glanced again toward the barn, where her horse's faint cough broke the silence, then to the door of her cabin, where a thin draft curled beneath the frame. His expression shifted slightly, something like sorrow or understanding passing across his features. The two men exchanged a look, one that spoke of decisions made through years of shared experience. Then, without another word, they stepped back toward their horses. Lydia watched as they mounted effortlessly, their silhouettes rising against the pale morning sky like great carved figures from a forgotten legend. She expected them to ride off immediately, but instead they lingered for a heartbeat longer, the quiet one's gaze touching her once more, softer this time, almost apologetic. Then they turned north, riding into the open white distance until the snow swallowed them whole. Lydia stood motionless, listening to the fading rhythm of hoofbeats until the silence returned to its reign. She tried to steady her breath, but her heart continued its uneven pounding. She didn't know why their words rattled through her chest, why concern rather than fear settled in their wake, or why their presence felt less like danger, and more like a warning whispered long before its meaning could be understood. As she finally gathered the last pieces of wood and turned toward her cabin, she noticed fresh cracks in the barn roof she hadn't seen before, the snow drifting in like quiet invaders. A tremor of dread passed through her. The storm clouds gathering on the horizon promised a harsh night ahead. She felt smaller than she had that morning, more fragile, more breakable. But it was the memory of the man's voice, steady, certain, spoken with a purpose she didn't yet grasp, that followed her inside, settling over her like a prophecy carved into the cold wind. "Pack your things and come with us." Long after the sky darkened and the wind rose again, those words continued to echo in her thoughts, leaving her with a single, undeniable truth. Whatever storm was coming, she would not be facing it alone for long. Winter settled deeper over Lydia Harrow's homestead like a long, unbroken sigh, turning every breath she drew into a reminder of how abandoned her life had become. Days slipped by without visitors, without warmth, without anything but the slow creak of the frost-distorted walls. She kept herself moving because motion felt like the only weapon she had left against despair. Each morning she stepped outside to gather what little would remain, the cold biting through her sleeves, the ground crunching beneath her boots like thin glass ready to shatter. She tried to ignore the echo of the words left behind by the two Apache elders, yet they lingered in her thoughts like footprints she couldn't erase. Her horse weakened more with each passing dawn. His sides hollowed further, breaths coming shallow and slow, each one sounding like a plea to be forgiven for failing her. She knelt beside him, brushing his mane with trembling fingers, whispering soft encouragements she feared he no longer heard. A knot formed in her throat every time she rose to leave him. She knew the day was coming when he wouldn't lift his head again, and she wished, selfishly, that she had someone to share that dread with. By midday the hunger gnawed at her. She had to go into town. The journey felt longer than usual, the wind dragging against her steps as if urging her to turn back. The settlement was small, but to Lydia it felt enormous when she walked alone through it. Eyes followed her, some sympathetic, most wary. Rumors had a way of settling like dust on a widow's shoulders, and she had stopped caring what shape they took. Still, the chill of silence greeted her in every direction. Sheriff Bram Haller stood near the general store, adjusting his gloves as he watched her approach. His presence always felt like a wall she had to walk around, tall and cold, offering no shelter. Lydia kept her gaze lowered, hoping to slip past him unnoticed, but he stepped forward just enough to force her to acknowledge him. He remarked on the worsening weather, though his tone carried no real concern. His eyes flicked toward the plains, where the two Apache elders had ridden days before. Lydia sensed his unspoken suspicion, the silent accusation that she was somehow inviting trouble simply by existing on the edge of their world. She murmured a polite response and moved on, refusing to give fear or shame a place to settle in her chest. Inside the store she purchased only what her meager coins allowed: flour that smelled faintly rancid, a handful of dried beans, and a small tin of salt she hoped would last the rest of winter. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the items, not from cold, but from the ache of knowing her provisions were still painfully thin. On her way out, Mrs. Edna Willow reached out, pressing a bundle of day-old bread into Lydia's hands. The older woman's touch was gentle, her eyes full of sympathy and worry. "Take it, dear," she whispered, voice barely louder than the rustle of her shawl. Lydia nodded, swallowing the gratitude that burned unexpectedly behind her ribs. Edna was one of the few who still looked at her without judgment, perhaps because she understood what loss did to a woman. Lydia began the long walk home, the bundle tucked close to her body. Snow fell in light drifts, settling on her hair, melting into the fine fabric of her dress. The cold traveled up her legs, numbing her feet until each step felt detached, as though she moved through a dream she could not wake from. Yet she pushed forward, allowing the rhythm of her footsteps to steady her breath. When she reached her homestead, the first thing she noticed was the woodpile. It had grown, neatly stacked, each log split perfectly, arranged with care she could not have mustered herself. She stared in disbelief, dropping the bread into the snow before scrambling to her knees to examine the footprints beside it. They were enormous. Boots larger than any she had seen. She touched the impression lightly, feeling the cold outline of a man who had stood here hours before. Her heart tightened. Elias. The quiet one. She didn't know how she knew which man had done it, only that the memory of his gaze lingered in her mind more vividly than his companion's. She rose slowly, turning toward her door, where a deer pelt draped across the knob like a silent offering. The fur was soft beneath her palm, still smelling faintly of pine and clean earth. She carried the pelt inside, hanging it beside the hearth. A warmth she hadn't felt in months settled over her, not from the fire, but from the realization that someone had noticed her struggle. Someone had cared enough to help without seeking thanks. She sat by the faint firelight, fingers brushing the fur again and again, her mind drifting toward the memory of Elias's expression as he had studied her home, his features etched with something softer than pity. Night fell quickly, casting shadows that moved across the walls like restless spirits. Lydia couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the boards, but it wasn't the storm outside that stole her rest. It was the thought of a man she barely knew walking across the frozen plains, simply to leave her kindness. She rose, wrapped herself in Caleb's old coat, and stepped outside. The moon hung like a pale lantern above the world. She scanned the horizon, half hoping to see the silhouettes of the two riders returning, though she knew it was foolish. She whispered a thank you into the night anyway, letting the wind carry her words wherever it wished. Something inside her shifted, a small, fragile spark pushing back against the long-held darkness. It didn't erase her grief, but it lessened its weight for a moment. The next morning brought a thin glow through her window, and with it, a sound she had not heard in days. Her horse breathing with a hint of strength. Lydia rushed to the barn, heart pounding, to find him sipping water with newfound effort. On the floor beside his feed trough lay a bundle of herbs tied with sinew, smelling of sage and something unfamiliar. She recognized them from stories, healing plants used by Apache healers. Kneeling beside them, she felt her breath catch in her throat. Elias had been here again. Watching. Helping. Caring in ways that confused and comforted her all at once. She stroked her horse's mane, whispering gratitude though she knew the quiet elder was far beyond hearing. But as she stepped outside, a gust of wind brushed her cheek, warm despite the winter, and she wondered if some part of him lingered still. The horizon stretched empty and cold before her, but she felt less alone than she had in months. Yet just as hope began to slip into her chest, the snow revealed something new. Fresh hoofprints leading away from her homestead, deep and urgent, as though someone had ridden off in haste. Lydia followed them to the edge of her land, heart thudding with a mixture of fear and longing, until they disappeared into the dense white. She stared after them, unsure whether the distance between them was growing or closing. But one truth settled over her with the certainty of an oncoming storm. Those prints were a promise, and a warning, that her life was no longer moving in solitude. The storm arrived with a ferocity Lydia had feared but never truly believed would come, tearing across the plains like a beast breaking free of its chains. Snow crashed against her cabin walls in furious waves, wind shrieking through every crack, and seemed as though the night itself wished to swallow her whole. She pressed her shoulder against the door, pushing it closed as the gale nearly tore it from her grasp. Her breath came in frantic clouds, hands numb, heart racing. She had survived many harsh nights, but this storm carried a weight she felt deep in her bones, a warning that her fragile world would not endure another blow. Inside, the fire sputtered, smoke clinging to the rafters as if unsure whether to rise or surrender. Lydia rushed to pile the last pieces of wood onto the fading flames, but the logs were damp, hissing rather than catching. The temperature fell so sharply it stole the breath from her lungs. She grabbed the deer pelt Elias had left, wrapping it around her shoulders. But even its dense warmth felt faint against the storm's relentless teeth. A long groan echoed through the cabin. The walls shivered. Snow forced its way through gaps beneath the roof, landing in soft white piles that quickly grew. Lydia's gaze shot upward just as a beam sagged, cracking under the weight of packed ice. She reached for a bucket, anything to brace it, but her arms trembled too violently. The roof gave way with a heavy thud that sent snow pouring into the room, extinguishing half the fire and leaving her choking on cold air. Her body shook uncontrollably. She stumbled toward the door, intending to reach the barn and fetch tools, but the moment she opened it, the storm roared in with such force it lifted her feet from the ground. She tried to scream, only to have the wind steal the sound from her throat. Snow blinded her, stinging her eyes, burning her skin. Her knees buckled. She fell into the drift, the world spinning, weightless and soundless as darkness crept in around the edges. When she woke, warmth pressed against her cheeks, gentle and steady. A soft glow filled her vision, amber light dancing across woven walls, shadows swaying like quiet guardians. She blinked slowly, her breath easing as the warmth seeped through her. She realized she lay on a bed of thick pelts inside a round shelter unlike anything she had known. Smoke drifted upward through a small opening at the top, carrying the clean scent of pine and burning cedar. Her gaze shifted, and she saw him. Elias sat beside the fire, back straight, hands steady as he fed small pieces of wood into the flames. The orange glow lit his weathered face, revealing lines etched by time and wisdom. His white hair, unbound tonight, hung loose over his shoulders like winter-coated silver. Tahana sat near the doorway, sharpening a blade with calm, measured strokes, his presence solid as carved stone. Lydia tried to speak, but her voice cracked before forming words. Elias turned immediately, concern flickering across his features. He reached for a carved wooden cup filled with steaming broth and held it out to her. She accepted it with trembling hands, the heat seeping into her palms like a balm. When she sipped it, the warmth traveled down her throat, loosening the cold that clung stubbornly inside her. "You froze," Elias murmured, his tone gentle, as though even the sound of his voice might break her further. "We found you outside your door, covered by snow." Lydia swallowed hard, the memory of the storm returning in fragmented flashes. She whispered a faint thank you, but the words felt far too small for what they had done. Tahana glanced her way, nodding once, the simple gesture carrying more reassurance than any speech could provide. Hours passed in a calm she had not known since Caleb's last winter. Elias moved with a quiet grace, tending the fire, adjusting the pelts around her, preparing herbs with practiced hands. The shelter smelled of earth and cedar, grounding her in a way her fragile cabin never had. She watched the way his large hands handled everything with a gentleness that felt almost sacred. How he knelt beside her to check her warmth, how he listened when she whispered about her horse, how his eyes softened when she spoke of Caleb. For the first time in months, she told someone the truth, not the version she gave neighbors who pitied her, but the quiet memories she held close. How Caleb had taught her to braid rope. How he used to leave wildflowers on the windowsill. How she had buried a part of herself with him. Elias didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty comfort. He simply listened, his presence a steady anchor as her memories drifted through the room. When she finished, he spoke of his own past. Of a wife who had walked into the spirit world many winters ago. Of quiet nights when loneliness lay beside him like a restless animal. His voice carried weight, not of grief alone, but of acceptance shaped by years of survival. She felt an unexpected kinship in that shared ache. Two souls marked by loss, learning how to breathe again. By morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight filtered through the shelter's entrance, casting a pale golden glow across Elias's face as he stepped outside. Tahana followed, lifting the flap so Lydia could glimpse the world beyond. Her breath caught. Her cabin stood injured but standing, the broken roof now propped with thick beams she did not remember having. A fresh pile of wood rested near the door, split and stacked with meticulous care. Smoke rose from her chimney, strong, steady, promising warmth. They had worked through the storm to save her home. Lydia stepped outside on shaky legs, leaning on Elias's arm as her feet found the snow. The cold pressed gently this time, no longer a threat. She stared at the cabin repairs, at the woodpile, at the clean path they had carved through drifts taller than her waist. Her eyes stung unexpectedly. Something deep within her, something long buried, unfolded like a timid flower meeting the first light of spring. She whispered that she didn't understand why they had done all this. Elias met her gaze, something unspoken but powerful simmering beneath the surface. "Because winter should not take those who fight to live," he replied softly. "And because no one should face the cold alone." His words settled over her like a warm cloak, stirring feelings she wasn't ready to name. She looked at him longer than she meant to, the morning light catching in his dark eyes, revealing a tenderness he never voiced aloud. But before she could respond, Tahana stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Elias's shoulder. A signal. A reminder. A warning. Their time here was ending, whether Lydia wished it or not. And in that silent moment, fear and yearning mingled in her chest as she realized something unsettling. Something that left her breathless in the cold morning air. They were preparing to leave. Snow softened the world into muted shades of white and silver as Lydia stepped out of the reconstructed shelter, her breath rising like a small prayer toward the pale morning sky. The storm had passed, but the echo of its fury still lingered in the wind, whispering through the pines that edged the plains. She wrapped the deer pelt tighter around her shoulders and looked toward her cabin, now strengthened by the hands of two men who owed her nothing, yet gave everything without hesitation. Her heart swelled with gratitude, but beneath it stirred something quieter, deeper, more fragile. She tried to ignore the sensation, but it refused to vanish, settling like soft embers beneath her ribs. Elias and Tahana stood a short distance away, speaking in low voices. Lydia couldn't understand their words, yet she recognized the tone, a conversation of decision. It made her stomach tighten. The giant Apache elders had saved her life, risked themselves for her home, and cared for her with a kindness she had not felt since her husband's death. But now there was a shift in their posture, something final in the way Elias held his reins, something heavy in how Tahana looked toward the horizon. She sensed an ending before it was spoken. She approached slowly, her boots crunching through the packed snow. Both men turned. Elias offered a faint nod, eyes gentle but shadowed. Tahana, ever the sentinel, watched the land behind her, as if expecting danger to rise from the whiteness. Lydia greeted them softly, her voice a thread carried by the cold air. She wanted to thank them again, to tell them how their presence had steadied the ground beneath her feet, but the words tangled inside her throat. Instead, she asked whether they would remain until the weather eased. Tahana's gaze shifted toward Elias, allowing the older man to speak. Elias stepped closer, his expression carved with something she couldn't read. "We must return soon," he said, the words simple but heavy. "There are matters waiting for us." "And you," he paused, eyes drifting over her repaired home, "you are safe now." Safe. The word stung more than she expected. Safety had not been the only thing she felt since they arrived. She murmured a quiet reply, unsure if her voice reached him. Something inside her clenched as she realized the warmth she had found in their presence might slip away before she had time to understand it. As the day brightened, Lydia returned to her chores, moving through them with a new sense of strength. Her horse walked with steadier steps, drinking and eating as though the storm had been nothing more than a passing dream. She whispered thanks for his recovery, but her mind kept drifting to Elias, the way his hands moved with reverence when tending to the fire, the calm in his voice when he reassured her, the sorrow she glimpsed in him like an old scar. She wondered whether he carried burdens he never spoke of, burdens as heavy as her own. The sky darkened with afternoon clouds by the time she went into town for supplies. Snowflakes drifted lazily, fluttering around her like fragile wings. The settlement felt colder than usual as she walked through it, the stares sharper, the whispers louder. Sheriff Bram Holler intercepted her near the general store. His eyes roamed over her with suspicion, the way some men inspected a stranger's horse before finding fault in it. He asked about the Apaches, voice dripping with distrust. He said they had been seen near her land, that their presence invited risk. Lydia felt her jaw tighten. She replied that they had helped her through the storm, that without them she would not be standing here. Bram sneered at her gratitude, telling her kindness was a currency she could not afford to give to men like them. His words struck like winter wind, brittle and cold, and though fear flickered in her, anger rose too, quiet but firm. She told him their help had been given freely, without harm. Bram's expression hardened. He leaned closer, voice low with warning. "Folks will talk, Lydia. A widow alone, keeping company with men like that. Take care you don't give them reason to believe the worst." The cruelty lodged in her chest long after she left him, echoing like a cracked bell. She grew up knowing people whispered when they didn't understand, but now the whispers threatened the only comfort she had felt in months. She walked home faster, breath shaking with emotion she couldn't contain. The snow thickened around her, each falling flake mirroring the weight settling beneath her heart. When she reached her homestead, dusk had already settled. Elias stood near the barn, checking the beams they'd reinforced. She hesitated, then approached him, unsure how to voice the turmoil inside her. He straightened, sensing her distress before she spoke. She recounted the sheriff's words in fragments, her voice trembling with a mixture of shame and wounded pride. Elias listened quietly, his expression shifting from concern to something harder, older, edged with pain. He looked toward the distant settlement, then back to her. His silence stretched, heavy with understanding. At last he spoke, saying that his presence brought her trouble she did not deserve, that he and Tahana should leave before the town used her as a weapon against them. The words struck her deeper than Bram's accusation. She shook her head, insisting that she had not asked them to go, that she did not want them to. But Elias's gaze softened in a way that broke her heart more than anger would have. He thanked her for her kindness, for her courage, but said that the world she lived in would not allow this crossing of paths without cost. She felt something crumble inside her. The thought of him leaving carved a hollow ache that pulsed beneath her ribs. She stepped closer without thinking, snow swirling between them like threads of silver. Her hand rose, almost touching his arm, but she pulled it back before it found him. He watched the gesture with a longing so quiet, she wasn't sure she imagined it. Their belongings were already packed. The horses stood saddled, waiting like silent messengers of fate. Tahana tightened the straps with methodical ease, though he paused once to meet Lydia's gaze. For a moment, she thought she saw sympathy in his eyes, perhaps even regret. Elias turned to her once more, snow collecting in his hair, his face etched with a sorrow that seemed carved from the very winter surrounding them. "These moments we shared will remain," he said quietly. "They are not lost." Lydia tried to speak, but her voice failed. She felt the weight of everything she could not say pressing against her chest. Gratitude, fear, longing, the strange warmth that had grown in the quiet spaces between them. She lowered her gaze, whispering a soft thank you that carried all she could not name. The men mounted their horses. Tahana gave her one last nod. Elias lingered, watching her with an expression that held both a beginning and an ending. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he turned his horse north, snow spiraling around them as they rode into the growing twilight. Lydia stood in the drifting white long after they disappeared. Her breath shook, her hands trembling beneath the pelt he had given her. The cold pressed against her, but she barely felt it. For the first time since Caleb's death, she realized she did not want to be alone anymore. The wind carried a distant echo of hoofbeats across the plains, fading slowly into silence. And as Lydia stepped toward her cabin, her heart thundering with unanswered longing, she was struck by a truth she had not allowed herself to feel until now. She wasn't waiting for spring. She was waiting for him. Night fell heavy over the plains, wrapping Lydia's cabin in trembling shadows as the wolves emerged from the treeline, their eyes glowing like embers scattered in the dark. She barred the door with shaking hands, listening to claws scrape against the wood, each sound a reminder that she was utterly alone. The lantern sputtered out, plunging the room into brittle silence. Lydia pressed her back to the wall, breath trembling as shadows prowled outside. She whispered Elias's name without meaning to, the sound barely a thread, carried by fear and longing. She didn't expect an answer. She only needed hope to hear her. Hoofbeats cracked through the storming dark like thunder rolling low across the earth. The wolves scattered, their snarls fading into startled silence. Lydia stumbled toward the window, just as two towering silhouettes cut through the swirling snow, Elias at the front, breath rising like smoke from a fire refusing to die. He reached her door before she could unbar it, forcing it open with a shove that sent cold air spiraling around them. His eyes swept over her, fierce with worry, as though the sight of her trembling form carved a wound deeper than any winter storm could manage. Lydia collapsed into him. Elias held her, as if afraid she might vanish back into the dark. His hands, enormous and trembling, cupped her face with reverence. He murmured her name like a promise he had carried too long in silence, a prayer breaking free at last. Lydia felt warmth bloom where grief once lived. "I tried to leave you behind," he whispered, yet each mile felt heavier. "The wind carried your name. The snow carried your face. Lydia, my heart returned before my body did." She stared up at him, tears brightening her eyes as the storm softened to flurries. She touched his chest, feeling his heartbeat drumming through winter hide. "I didn't want you to go," she breathed, the truth slipping out like thawed snow. His hand covered hers, dwarfing it yet holding it with the gentleness of a man afraid to crush hope. Elias lowered his forehead to hers, his breath mingling with the warmth she offered. "I care for you, Lydia," he said, voice rough with emotion he could no longer contain. Not with the spark of youth, but with the slow, steady fire of a man who has lost and learned to love again. Lydia's breath hitched, her heart reaching toward him with a longing she had tried to bury beneath grief. She whispered that being with him felt like stepping from shadow into dawn. Elias's eyes shone, soft and fierce, as though her words mended something long broken. Outside, the last of the wolves fled into the trees, their howls fading as if conceding the night to something stronger. Elias drew her into his arms, lifting her as though she weighed no more than the breath she carried. And as he stepped over the threshold, a new future now followed them in.